Nigeria spends 67% of a full minimum wage paycheck on food. Not food and rent, not food and everything else, just food, and only the amount its own government defines as the bare minimum to eat a healthy diet. 67% gone before a single other bill gets paid. That number comes from Nigeria's own statistics office, not from me, not from an estimate, not from a spreadsheet I built off scattered receipts the way earlier videos in this series had to. 10 videos in, and this one breaks the format completely. No single product this time. Every country's own official minimum food or living basket, priced the way that country's own government actually calculates it. But this video isn't really about the numbers themselves. It's about where those numbers came from, who decided them, and under what circumstances. Every single one of these 10 countries built its definition of, quote, the bare minimum during a specific moment in its own history, usually during a crisis, a war, a currency collapse, or a political transition. And most of them have never fully rebuilt that definition since. 3 of them, in fact, have basically stopped trying altogether. This is going to run longer than usual because a number without its history is just a number. Stick with it because some of these origin stories are stranger than the rankings themselves. Let's go country by country, and this time let's actually ask where each one came from, not just what it says today. Start with Russia, because its history is short and violent. The phrase "потребительская корзина" didn't exist in Russia until 1992, created by presidential decree right after the Soviet Union collapsed, when the entire economy needed a new definition of survival almost overnight, replacing a planned system that had never needed to price the minimum in market terms at all. That first version listed about 156 items, food and non-food combined, drawn up in a matter of months during hyperinflation, currency chaos, and the collapse of the old Soviet distribution system. A federal law locked in the methodology in 1999, and for the next 22 years, this exact number decided how much every kind of state benefit in the country was worth. Pensions, child support, working age subsistence, all of it, tied directly to whatever the basket cost that quarter. Revisions came in 2006 and again in 2012, mostly adjusting item counts and quantities rather than the underlying logic. Then in 2021, Russia formally stopped using it as the legal basis for benefits, switching to a method tied to median income instead, a quieter, less politically visible number. The food basket itself didn't disappear though. An independent workers' union group kept tracking it anyway, publishing updates that carry no legal weight but still get cited constantly in the press. That's the number you're seeing today, 8,992 rubles, about $97 a month. Minimum wage sits around $291. That's roughly a third of it, about 7 days of work a month, for a number the government itself walked away from using officially 4 years ago, now kept alive mostly out of habit and public interest rather than law. The United States tells almost the opposite story. Not abandonment, but a 46-year freeze, hiding in plain sight inside a program most Americans only vaguely understand. The Thrifty Food Plan traces back to something called the Economy Food Plan, first built in 1962, explicitly designed as the cheapest of 4 government diet plans the USDA maintained. Not the healthiest, deliberately the cheapest, meant for genuine emergencies rather than sustained daily use. It got renamed the Thrifty Food Plan in 1975, and it was revised on paper in 1983, 1999, and 2006, each time with new nutrition science, new food prices, new consumption survey data feeding into the calculation. But here's the part that matters more than any single revision. In every single one of those updates, the government explicitly held its real value locked to that original 1962 baseline, adjusted only for inflation, never allowed to reflect updated nutrition science or actual eating patterns in a way that would cost more money. For 46 straight years, its real purchasing power never once increased, even as dietary guidelines changed completely, even as SNAP recipients spent decades hearing that the benefit was calculated using the best available science, when in practice, it was locked to a 1962 emergency ration plan with an inflation adjustment stapled on top. It took an executive order from the Biden administration in 2021 explicitly directing USDA to revisit the underlying method rather than just the price tag, to finally break that freeze and let the number reflect an actual healthy diet instead of the cheapest theoretical one from over half a century earlier. Today, it sits around $305 a month for one adult. Minimum wage, still $7.25 an hour federally, unchanged since 2009, gives you about $1,256 a month. That's about 5 days of work for the government's current baseline diet. The first version of that baseline in nearly 5 decades that was allowed to actually get better instead of just keeping pace with inflation. Nigeria has the newest, most current number on this entire list, and it deserves credit for that even though the result is brutal. The cost of a healthy diet metric gets recalculated monthly by the National Bureau of Statistics, using a methodology built with international development partners specifically to track real-time food affordability using actual current market prices across the country, not a decades-old snapshot dusted off and inflated forward. Right now, it sits around $32 a month. Minimum wage is about $48. Divide it out, and you get that 67% figure from the opening. Over 14 days of a full month's work just to eat enough to stay healthy. Not comfortably, not with variety, using a number that's more current than almost anything else on this list, updated with fresher data than the US, than Switzerland, than Norway, and it still produces the single worst result of the 7 usable countries by a wide margin. Now, the countries where the history gets complicated because the number isn't food alone, and the history behind why is its own story. Switzerland's system traces back to the early 1900s, to a body called the Swiss Poor Relief Conference, which spent decades trying to standardize wildly different cantonal welfare rules into something coherent. Because Switzerland, true to form, never built one single national system, just 26 cantons each doing their own thing under loose federal guidance. The first written recommendations with actual franc amounts came in 1963, the same year Spain's minimum wage was born in Ocean Away, though the two systems couldn't have come from more different politics. A total revision in 1997 introduced the modern flat-rate Grundbedarf, set at 1,010 francs a month in 1998, explicitly framed at the time as covering not just physical survival, but a minimum of social participation, a genuinely progressive idea for its era. Here's the part that should bother you more than any of the rankings in this video. In 2005, Switzerland introduced so-called integration incentive reforms that allowed this basic rate to be cut by up to 30% under certain conditions, meant to push recipients back toward employment. By 2019, the nominal franc amount had only just crawled back to roughly its 1998 level, 1,031 francs. Nominal. Not adjusted for the almost 17% of inflation that had happened in the meantime. In real inflation-adjusted terms, one of the richest countries on Earth had quietly let its own social safety net shrink for over 2 decades, before finally tying the whole thing to an inflation index in 2010, so this kind of silent erosion couldn't happen again without someone noticing. Today, it sits at $1,180 a month, bundling food with clothing, hygiene, communication, and a small leisure allowance, calculated off real household spending data collected every few years. Geneva's minimum wage runs about $4,258 a month. Even after 2 decades of that particular history, it's still only about 6 days of work. Norway's version is younger and calmer, born in ordinary bureaucratic time rather than crisis. The national guideline rates only started in 2001, set by the Social and Health Department to bring some consistency to municipalities that had previously each set their own local welfare rates with no shared reference point at all. Inflation adjustment only started in 2006, 5 years after the rates began, meaning for half a decade, the numbers could quietly lose value with nobody formally required to fix it. In 2023, a political deal between the government and a minor coalition partner in budget negotiations pushed through a rare 10% emergency increase on top of the usual annual adjustment, in unusually direct public acknowledgement that the standard number wasn't keeping up with the cost of actually living. Oslo's current rate, updated this January, sits at 9,406 kroner a month, about $980, covering food, clothes, communication, and household basics, but explicitly not rent, electricity, or transport, which get assessed separately case by case, precisely because those costs vary so much between a studio in Oslo and a house somewhere rural. On Norway's hospitality wage floor, that's also about 6 days of work. Almost identical to Switzerland's result, from a system with a completely different birth story, half a century younger, built by ordinary civil servants rather than a century of poor relief negotiation, and shaped by very different politics entirely. Japan's number comes from the aftermath of a war, more directly than any other country on this list. Article 25 of the 1947 post-war Constitution, written under Allied occupation guidance while Japan was still under foreign administration, guaranteed every citizen a right to a minimum standard of healthy and cultured living, language that sounds almost poetic compared to the dry administrative phrasing everywhere else on this list. The Public Assistance Act followed in 1950, while the country was still rebuilding from total devastation, and welfare rolls actually peaked that same year, before dropping for decades, only surpassing the 1951 record in 2011, 6 decades later, after prolonged economic stagnation pushed the numbers back up. The system's been revised regularly ever since, including bumps as recent as October 2023 and October 2025, tied to consumption surveys the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare runs on low-income households directly. Tokyo's current standard for a single person comes to about 83,700 yen a month, around $536. Again, bundling food with clothing and daily necessities, a system built explicitly around the idea that dignity, not just physical survival, was a constitutional right owed to every citizen. Against Tokyo's minimum wage, that works out to roughly 8.5 days, the slowest number among every country where the math actually holds together, from the country that arguably wrote the most idealistic version of the minimum into its founding law. Spain's minimum wage has the strangest origin of all, and it's worth sitting with for a second. It was created in 1963 under Franco's dictatorship, not from any labor movement or union negotiation, since Franco's Spain allowed neither free unions nor real collective bargaining. It functioned instead as a top-down gesture, a way for the regime to look socially stable to the rest of Europe without conceding any actual worker power. The first version was worth about 10 euros a month in today's terms, roughly 36 pesetas a day. It's been raised 62 times since, through the death of the dictatorship, the return of democracy in the late 1970s, entry into the European Economic Community, the switch from pesetas to euros, and a nearly 50% jump in a single year in 2019 that took it from under 900 euros to over 1,100, one of the most aggressive single increases anywhere on this list. It now sits at 1,221 euros a month for 2026, following a 3.1% raise agreed with unions just this year. The grocery basket itself isn't government set at all, notably, unlike the minimum wage sitting right next to it. It's a market-tracked figure, currently about 230 euros, $248 a month, that cost of living researchers and consumer groups update independently, no royal decree involved. Against Spain's minimum wage, that's just over 4 days of work, the best number on this entire list, arrived at through a minimum wage that started life as a dictatorship's public relations exercise, and somehow, 6 decades and 62 revisions later, outperforms every democracy on this list. And now the 3 that don't work. And it's worth understanding exactly how each one got stuck, because the mechanism of failure is different every single time. India's poverty line was last touched by a committee report in 2014, part of a much longer lineage of committees stretching back decades, each one revising how India defines subsistence, from early academic work in the 1970s through official planning commission methodologies in the 1990s and 2000s. That 2014 report leaned on household survey data collected back in 2011 and 2012, and it was never even formally adopted as the country's official poverty line to begin with, existing instead in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, cited constantly by researchers while lacking the government stamp that would make it binding policy. No government since has convened a new committee to update it. Over a decade of inflation sits on a number that was already old the year it was published, sitting on top of methodology fights that go back 2 generations, and nobody in Delhi has moved to resolve either problem. Vietnam's official poverty threshold is tied to survey work from around 2012 and 2013, from the same statistical tradition that's tracked the country's transformation since the market reforms of the late 1980s turned a centrally planned economy into one of the fastest growing in the world. That same statistical apparatus that documented one of the great economic transformations of the era apparently stopped updating its most basic subsistence number right around the time growth accelerated the most, which is its own kind of irony. Whatever the number says today, it's still describing prices from over a decade in the past, carried forward as if nothing had changed in an economy that's changed more than almost any other on this list. Egypt's case is the strangest, because it's not just old, it's been actively broken by events since. The statistics agency CAPMAS built its last poverty figures on a survey from 2019 and 2020, right before a currency crisis that nobody could have fully planned around. Then the currency collapsed, not once, but across several devaluations in the years after, each one resetting what enough money to survive actually meant in Egyptian pounds. Researchers who study Egypt now describe those old poverty numbers as functionally meaningless for anything happening in the country today, and CAPMAS itself has held off publishing a full update rather than release something built on a currency that no longer functions the same way it did when the underlying survey was conducted. 3 countries, 3 completely different decades where the clock effectively stopped for 3 completely unrelated reasons: an abandoned committee process in India, an unremarkable statistical lag in Vietnam, an active currency collapse in Egypt, and one identical practical result across all 3. The number exists on paper with a government letterhead attached to it somewhere. Using it here would just be lying with better sourcing. So here's the honest ranking. Only for the 7 countries where the number still means something today and worth pausing on before we get to what it all adds up to. Spain, just over 4 days of work. United States, 5 days. Switzerland, 6 days. Norway, 6 days. Russia, 7 days. Japan, 8.5 days. Nigeria, over 14 days. Look at where the wealth actually sits in that order. Switzerland and Norway, 2 of the richest countries by almost any measure, 2 of the highest minimum wages in this entire 10 video series, land squarely in the middle, not at the top. Spain, a country that spent most of this series sitting quietly in the background compared to the Switzerlands and Norways everyone expects to win, comes out ahead of the United States entirely, on a minimum wage with a genuinely embarrassing political origin story. And Nigeria's number isn't just the worst by a small margin, the way some of the closer results in earlier videos were. It's more than double the next worst result on this list, using the single most current, most rigorously updated data point of the entire 7. Not an old number, not an estimate, the freshest figure here. And it still produces the bleakest outcome by a wide margin. What strikes me most, looking back across all 10 histories, isn't the ranking itself. It's how differently each country arrived at the idea of a minimum and how much that origin still shapes the number sitting on screen today. Russia built its number out of the wreckage of a collapsing state in a matter of months, under conditions closer to emergency triage than careful policy design. The US built its number to be as cheap as legally defensible from the start, then froze it there for almost half a century out of sheer institutional inertia, dressed up the entire time as being based on current science when it demonstrably wasn't. Switzerland built a genuinely humane definition early on, one that explicitly included dignity and social participation, then quietly let it shrink in real terms for 20 years before anyone with enough authority noticed enough to fix it. Norway built a calmer, more bureaucratic version, born in ordinary budget negotiations rather than crisis, and still needed an emergency political deal in 2023 just to catch the number up to reality. Japan built its number into the constitution itself, out of the ashes of total war, arguably the most idealistic legal foundation of anything on this list, and still produces the slowest result among the usable 7. Spain's number started as a dictator's public relations stunt, engineered specifically to avoid giving workers any real power, and somehow became one of the better performing minimums on this entire list anyway, 62 revisions and 1 democracy later. And 3 countries, for 3 completely unrelated reasons, just stopped updating theirs entirely and are still quoting numbers from a decade or more ago as though the intervening years simply didn't happen to prices, wages, or currencies. 10 videos of testing single products taught one lesson over and over, video after video. The ranking depends entirely on what you're measuring, and the wage usually matters more than the price tag sitting on the shelf. This video taught something the earlier ones never really touched, something that only shows up once you stop comparing prices and start comparing definitions. The idea of enough isn't a fixed, timeless fact sitting out there waiting to be measured accurately, the way the price of a liter of milk is. It's a political decision made at a specific moment by specific people, usually under specific pressure, whether that's a currency collapsing, a war just ending, or a dictatorship trying to look respectable to its neighbors. And then that decision gets left alone for years or decades, depending entirely on whether anyone still in power feels like revisiting it, or whether it's easier to just let an old number keep quietly doing its job, technically still in force, technically still official, and practically less and less connected to whatever people are actually paying at the register. If you want an entire video on any one of these 7 histories, on how Switzerland let its own safety net shrink for 2 decades before anyone fixed it, or why the US Thrifty Food Plan stayed frozen at a 1962 emergency ration level for 46 years, while officials described it as scientifically current. Say which one in the comments and I'll build the next one around it properly, with time to actually dig into primary sources rather than compress it into one segment among 10. And if a channel willing to say 3 out of 10 official numbers just don't work anymore and explain exactly why instead of quietly ignoring the problem is worth following, that's what subscribing does here. Not a promise of a specific next product this time, just more of this, whenever the next honest comparison turns up something worth actually showing you.